Self-esteem is about comparing ourselves to our ideal self, and maybe change your ideal self. Maybe that's the problem sometimes, is that you're trying to be this person who has control over everything. Or your idea of who you should be is that you should be this absolute perfect human, and maybe that's something to work on and change.
Welcome to the Red Print, your wellness podcast. I'm Daanish.
I'm Rachel.
And I'm Neil.
Today we're going to be talking about self-esteem, including what are some of the elements that cause low self-esteem in students,
why it's not uncommon to feel like an imposter,
and some quick tips and tricks for improving your self-esteem.
Welcome to the Red Print, your wellness podcast. So today we're going to be talking about self-esteem. So I feel like everyone has their own individual opinion potentially towards this. However, I think a common theme for self-esteem is, I suppose, I was looking up, and then before I even started researching, I feel like it's how one views themselves, like how you feel about yourself, like when you look at a task, do you think you can do it or can't do it? And then I looked, one definition I saw was a really good one by Rosenberg. So either a favorable or unfavorable attitude towards oneself. So to decide where, of course, your self-esteem level is at, you could, of course, find out, is it favorable, unfavorable, find out exactly where you stand upon, I suppose, a scale, more or less. And remember, it's not something that's fixed. It's not something that's rigid, staying the same, because of course from when you were a child all the way to adulthood, teenage years, it shifts, doesn't it? Like you go through chapters, or I don't know, hills, peaks, slumps, or whatever, of how you feel at the end of the day. And I think understand that I feel like you can actually mold your own self-esteem. Like I'm sure you guys will both agree, as in when you know you're not, I suppose, best version of yourself. Like I realized this a couple of years ago, like I didn't have high self-esteem. Like I was always confident, but sometimes I go through like a really, a downing stage. Like I'm just like, but then I pick myself up. I'm like, yeah, cool. And I get my confidence back. So what do you guys think about self-esteem? Like, yeah, what are your thoughts? Tell me about it.
Yeah, I really like the point you made about how it changes, and gonna surprise you, being on a journey. Hey! And I read something about this. So while I was researching, I read something and I was like, oh my goodness, that's exactly the change that has happened in my brain. So when I was younger, I had very, very, very low self-esteem in a way, because I'm gonna give you a caveat in a moment, but I thought that I was objectively worse than everyone. I thought that I was ugly and worthless and just like all the worst things I believed about myself. And I would do like weird things, like I would walk behind my friends. I would never walk alongside them. I'd walk behind them to really demonstrate how much of a worse person I was. And I would never like ask for anything or make a decision. Like if someone said, oh, do you want a drink? I'd be like, I don't know. And I would not make decisions because I didn't want to impose, because I was this worthless human. So I had kind of low self-esteem, but also at the same time, I thought I was a bit better than everyone because of that. So I was like, I know how awful I am. I've got such low self-esteem. I'm so humble that I'm amazing. Like, so I had this like simultaneously, I had really low self-esteem where I thought like, I am human garbage. I must sit on the floor. I must walk behind people, but also thought, yeah, I'm a bit special. Like I've realized this. So I just had this weird, like dual self-esteem. And then I was reading this article about different kinds of self-esteem, and they called it, so it's like, what are the people's names? It is Ito Kawasaki and Kodama, and they said that there is a self-esteem which is sense of superiority, and one which is sense of authenticity. And I think then I had this self-esteem which came from sense of superiority. So it was, am I better than other people? Am I worse than other people? So it was all about comparing myself to other people for both areas of it. Whereas now my self-esteem just comes from sense of authenticity. It's not about, am I better or worse than other people? It's just, am I being myself? Am I sort of doing what I want to do? And so now I think I just have like normal self-esteem, and it's because I'm not comparing myself to other people and constantly thinking about it. Whereas before I was being a bit weird.
That's key. Like as you transition, that's a very important point.
What about you, Neil?
Interesting. I thought until I was starting to read about what self-esteem is, because one of those words, like so many things, you use it all the time, but then it's not necessarily actually known what it is. And when I started to read about it, I was like, oh, maybe I have low self-esteem. Like maybe that is because I think myself like I'm a pretty confident person. My job requires me to be confident. I enjoy that aspect of that of my job. I'm good at that aspect of my job. But the really interesting one for me when I was reading about the definitions of self-esteem was that it's your perception of yourself in comparison to where you think you should be. So it's the kind of like the gap between where you think you are and where you want to be. And I think generally speaking, I see that as quite a big gap. And I see it as something that I'm good at reflecting on things that have gone wrong. I'm not particularly good at reflecting on things that have gone well. I often feel like I'm a bit behind on stuff. I often feel like that, very rarely do I go into a room and be like, cool, I've got this. I know what I'm doing here. I always feel like I'm lagging that little bit. So it was really interesting to read that. I was like, oh, that actually, I guess, is low self-esteem. And then when I was thinking about that, it's the way I guess I deal with that, and the reason why I haven't seen it as something that's necessarily problematic, but have instead started to be rethinking this, is that I then use that to push myself, to try and improve and to try and make myself feel more comfortable in a situation. So I think the moments where I have had I see myself being most creative or original probably comes from having that sense of there being a big difference between me and where I'd want to be. So that, I think that's kind of my default position. But then when I'm reading about that also isn't necessarily a great strategy, because that's the sort of thing that leads to bigger issues. But yeah, so I find it really fascinating reading about this, because and seeing the difference between self-esteem and confidence, and there's very different elements of it.
For self-esteem or just confidence in general, I think it's important to, I suppose, get out of your head and get a little bit uncomfortable, because as mentioned, I think like a little bit in the earlier podcast, like a couple of years ago, when I wasn't doing anything, like I was just nothing, like not nothing, but as in I wasn't doing anything productive. And then through doing nothing productive, my self-esteem was low, my confidence wasn't there, because I had no, I suppose, confidence behind the actions I was committing to. And then as I've done the task more and more and more, I was like, okay, I know what to do, because you have the relevant experience behind your tasks. You can go into whatever you are going into with confidence. But of course, that isn't something that's going to happen overnight. Because if you look at it, like, how those quotes are like, Rome wasn't built in a day, for example. Like if you consistently chip away at whatever you would like to go towards, you're going to get more confidence. And self-esteem and confidence, I think, are very closely linked together, because the more you feel good about yourself, the more you'd like to, I suppose, get yourself in front of anything uncomfortable, because you've been through similar scenarios.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's kind of a link, but then for me, I think as well, those things have been detached from each other a little bit. Because sometimes there'll be things that I'm not confident about. I don't think, I think I'm someone who maybe actually has fairly high self-esteem in a way, but I'm not super confident. I don't think I'm amazing at everything. I don't think I'm necessarily going to succeed at everything. Because I was reading, because I know you mentioned, I can't remember the name of the person, but you mentioned like there's a scale and there's like a test you can do. And I was looking through the test. And one of the things was about like whether you see yourself as someone who can fail at things. And I definitely like fail at things all the time, and I expect to fail at things. But I have this just intrinsic sense of self-worth from repeatedly listening to Pork and Beans by Weezer. So I just listen to that and I'm like, nothing matters. Doesn't matter like what anyone thinks of me. And I think I do just have this internal sense of just, no matter what, like, I've got some self-worth. Doesn't matter what other people think. Doesn't matter if I do badly, you know, so long as I'm sort of doing right by, we've mentioned this before, just doing right by my values. And I think for some people, self-esteem and increasing your self-esteem might come from hitting targets, to be more productive, things like that. But for other people, maybe that's not the case. And that's not the case for me. But also there might be some people who maybe you've got a disability, or maybe you've got certain barriers that mean you're not going to do the exact same things as other people, and not going to be, you know, as sort of traditionally productive. And I'm doing this in inverted commas if you're listening, because I don't want to suggest that disabled people can't be productive. But maybe you're not going to just do things in the same way as other people. But no matter who you are and what is going on in your life and what you're able to contribute to society, you deserve to have self-worth, and you have, you know, value as a human just for existing. So I think, yeah, confidence and self-esteem linked in some ways, linked for some people, but also I think even if you're not feeling confident, you can still have a sense of self-worth and self-esteem.
I agree.
What do you think for, you know, contemporary students? What are the big aspects that might influence self-esteem? What do you think? Because there's, you know, is it going to come down to things like performance? Is it going to come down to how you're interacting with people? What do you reckon are the kind of the big factors that really play into people's self-esteem as a student, you know, in that 3 years being at university?
I think it's especially both points you mentioned. You have performance, or I suppose grades, because I feel like university students in general, when they get a mark back, they either look at that mark, and when they see that grade, they then reflect on that grade for their self-worth. If they do bad, they beat themselves up. I've been through that. Like when I do bad, I'm like, come on. But then I'm like, you got this, carry on, go forward, get a better grade, put in the work. And then you have, what is it? I suppose meeting new people like first year, like when you're unsure how to navigate it. For example, you're trying to figure out, I suppose, in a weird sense, like, not, I suppose, without the like mystical wishy-washy stuff, like discover yourself, like in first year, like what you do and stuff like that. Because like for me, it was like the first major, I suppose, time period away from home, like, and I'm very like family centered, so it was a very weird time, but being around people who I suppose I connected with made it a lot easier. So in terms of self-esteem, it was, I suppose, finding more about myself, like not, what's the word, trying to compare my scenario to other people's scenarios, and then just owning myself. Because I feel like when you're in university, you're very worried about the results of anything, whether it be, as mentioned, grades, people around you, meeting new people, anything. I think it's important to just let it happen, because you're not going to be in control of the end scenario. You can put forth your actions, your energy. However, you're not in charge of the result. I suppose whenever you're in a scenario, you just let it be. Like, there's no point trying to focus on everything, because you can't. Like, no human being can control every single thing. It could be kind of like an X-Men, like, I don't know, Professor Xavier, or I don't know, something like that. But that's not real life, okay? Real life is put forth the actions and let it be. You're not in control of. You can adjust the outcome, but you're not in control of it.
I think it's a really good point. It reminds me, I was looking through one of the little rabbit holes that I was going down was looking at personality types and self-esteem, and looking at things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And there was one thing that I was reading that was talking about the link between introversion and self-esteem, and another one that was talking about the last one on the MBTI is the judging and perceiving. And judging and perceiving is all about, your element of control over a situation, and that being very highly linked with self-esteem. And the more control you want over a situation, potentially the lower self-esteem you have, because you are always going to be finding out that you don't have much control over a situation, because that's what life is like. So I think that's really interesting, that idea of control and understanding your relationship with control influencing how you see self-esteem, and actually being comfortable with a bit more uncertainty. And earlier you mentioned about failure, and failure comes from some sort of uncertainty, and being comfortable with that, and that perhaps giving you a more realistic sense of self, or sense of ideal self, rather than I want to be this person who is in control. I want to be this godlike the image of myself that I see is this godlike thing that is always in control, is always able to predict and plan and identify, etc., etc. Whereas actually, if we can get rid of that idea of control, perhaps that's going to influence self-esteem. So yeah, really interesting. Because I was very curious reading about the MBTI stuff.
Lovely points, both of you. Seriously, like Daanish, I think that was brilliant advice, and I think you identified kind of the key areas. Like definitely when I was a student, the things that that impacted my self-esteem the most were grades and and friendships, and feeling like I wasn't making those connections fast enough, and I was the weirdo and things like that. And Neil, I loved your point there, and I think that's a really interesting point about, you mentioned that self-esteem is about comparing ourselves to our ideal self. And maybe change your ideal self. Maybe that's the problem sometimes, is that you're trying to be this person who has control over everything. Or your idea of who you should be is that you should be this absolute perfect human. And maybe that's something to work on and change. So I think that brings me to the question of, how can you improve your self-esteem? If anyone's listening to this and they're thinking, you know what, my self-esteem is, you're describing me when you're talking about bad self-esteem. So what can they do to improve their self-esteem?
I think for me, one thing that's very closely linked to, I suppose, self-esteem, confidence, it might not be the same for everyone, but is just physical exercise, and food. Like when I have low self-esteem, low confidence, I'm not eating right. I'm avoiding food really, because I'm trying to focus on everything else rather than focusing on myself. I'm just focusing on other things besides myself. And then I suppose not exercising. I can look in the mirror, and when I look in the mirror and I know I'm not pushing myself, I can sense it. Like I look in the mirror, I'm like, okay, have you been exercising? Have you been looking after yourself? And then through that, I know where I'm at, I suppose, mentally, like through the mental toughness program I'm doing now, through exercising like every day and eating right. Like what's that word? I feel a sense of pride, but not ego. I'm working out and I'm eating right and I'm happy for that. And then through that, I'm like, yeah, I just, when you just like, yeah. So for me, it's, I suppose, getting that routine and sticking to the promises I keep myself, because I feel like when I lack confidence, I'm not sticking to the promises I keep myself. I keep on pushing them to the next day, to the next day, to the next day. But when you stick to it, you gain more confidence, because you know you can do what you got to do. Just start with one thing a day, build it up, get those habits going. That's it. For me, anyway. That's it.
Yeah, the interesting one that I was reading about as well, that what comes up in almost everything in self-esteem is about positive self-affirmations. Like, I can do this. This is what I'm going to be. This is how I'm going to do things. And one of the positive, and most of the time that's framed as like, this is something you should do, positive self-affirmation. And then there are a few things I was reading saying, actually, that doesn't help. That's good for people with high self-esteem, but for people with low self-esteem, positive self-affirmation doesn't necessarily work, because what you're then doing is you're saying, I am going to do this amazing thing, and this is where I'm going to be. Well, actually, if you've already got low self-esteem, then you're already seeing that there's a massive gulf in between you and where that's going to be. So what you end up doing is you actually say that, and it becomes more stressful, and you reject that idea. So you actually push it away from you. So actually, positive self-affirmations can make that thing feel like it's further away, rather than it being something that's in your grasp. Whereas if you've got higher self-esteem, you can say, I'm going to do that thing, and it's a relatively small hop to get to there. And I found that really interesting. It's kind of a backwards answer to the question about how do we improve self-esteem. Well, here's something that might not necessarily help, only because it comes up so much. To say, for me, it just doesn't work. I find it really stressful, the positive self-affirmation thing, because it just makes me think that, like, it feels like failure is then inevitable when I say this kind of thing. When I found that really, really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I was wondering if that was going to come, because I've heard that too, and I think as well it's kind of like a cultural thing too. Like, as British people, I think it's a bit awkward to be like, I'm a great person,
Yeah.
I'm amazing, I can do anything. Like, I feel like it's kind of like clashes our culture, and I had heard that before, and I had tried that. When I knew that my self-esteem was a problem, I was like, okay, this is what I should do, and it made me feel horrific. Like you said, I just felt like, obviously this isn't true, and for some people this might work. So cool if it works for you, fantastic. But something kind of adjacent that I think I did find helpful was like stopping self-deprecating humor, so trying to not put myself down, but also jokingly saying good things about myself. And on Twitter, I had my like tagline on Twitter for years. So I got to in like 2009. My tagline was "the best person you'll ever meet," which I thought obviously a joke. But I would do that. I would make jokes about how amazing I am. But I think it did kind of like help a little bit. But I ended up getting rid of that. It was because I left it there for years, and it was when I applied for my job at UE that I got rid of it, because I was like, oh my God, if someone actually does look at my Twitter and then they think that I actually think that I'm the best person you'll ever meet, they'll think that I'm really strange. But really, it was when I wrote that, I thought it was hilarious because it was so the opposite of the truth. But that's been kind of my version of affirmations, is just joking about being good.
Within just that tagline is something very important, like with your point, Neil, as well, both connect very closely. So firstly, you talk about that gulf between low self-esteem and high self-esteem. When you're doing the affirmations, there's that gulf. You're like, you say the affirmations, but then in your head you're like, is this really possible? It's not possible, but you still do it anyway because you think it's going to work. But in the end, we both know that doesn't work. So then, connecting to Rachel's point, when you said, I am the best person you ever meet, I feel like that's what people should change the affirmation to, saying I am, or I suppose in terms of future sense, because instead of saying, it's very, I suppose, finicky. So let's say, for example, you want something out there. Let's say you want what's a common. You want a first. For me, that's just like, yeah, okay, you want a first at university. Okay, cool. You want a first in university. So what you can do to help before the affirmations really is, or alongside the affirmations, is do the small tasks every day. So let's say just read a certain amount, or just do something small and turn that into a habit. And alongside turning this into a habit, then put in the affirmations of where you're going to be in line with your tasks. Because I feel like I share the same point as you, Rachel, when you're doing the affirmations and it's not going to happen. Well, that's because we're not doing the work behind it, if that makes sense. We're just kind of leaving it up to fate or something, the universe or whoever you want to say. We're just putting it out there, hoping it'll stick to something, like, like what's that Jackson Pollock painting? Like you're flicking paint at the canvas and hopefully something sticks. However, put some work towards it, do your affirmations, connect them together, because then it's forming something solid. It's not very wishy-washy because you're doing the work, you're repeating it in your head, and you can see what you want rather than just throwing something out there. You're throwing something tangible out there. You're not throwing, I don't know, air or whatever you'd like to call it out there. So yeah, do it.
It's really interesting, and this impact of language, and the how we use language can impact then how we see ourselves. And I came across this really useful, thinking about the kind of the practicality around self-esteem. A really useful document. We'll drop it into the links for the episode, but from the University of Edinburgh, and it's actually about imposter syndrome. Have you guys come across this idea before?
I've heard of it, when you feel like a fraud.
Exactly. You feel like you don't belong in a place. You feel like you're always about to get found out. It's kind of linked with these ideas around self-esteem. You're the odd one out in the room, and someone's going to come in and go, "Are you meant to be here?" And again, I guess students are going to feel like that at university sometimes, being like, "Oh, I just got in here by luck," and at some point, someone's going to realise who I am. Really interesting little area. But there's one particular document from the University of Edinburgh, and they go through these particular activities. And one of those that I was just looking at here is about developing a professional mantra. And what they talk about there is use positive language, not as in it doesn't have to be the "I am the greatest, I am the best," but it's using positive language about things that you do, rather than things that are outside of your control. So you say, this is what I am, this is the things that I do achieve, this is the things that I can achieve, these are the things that are in my control. And then use a different sort of language for the things that are outside of your control. I would prefer to do this, not I must do this, not I must win at everything, not I must be perfect at everything. I would really like to be able to do this. But it's those subtle shifts in language. And let's say there's a few activities that they list through, and one of those as well is talking to other people about their experiences of this, because a lot of the time, I remember first hearing about ideas of self-esteem and imposter syndrome in academia, and it was when I was doing my PhD at the time. I came across this, and I was like, "Oh my god, I feel like this," and it was at a conference at the time, and speaking to my supervisor, he was like, "Yeah, everyone feels like that. Everyone feels like, everyone in this room, like, and the people that are probably the loudest, the people that are probably asking the most intelligent questions, the people who are there who are telling you about how amazing they are, they probably also feel like that too." And I think in speaking to your peers and people that are like doing the same thing that you are, being honest, and finding out that other people are actually feeling the same, it takes some of the sting out of it, and realizing that other people feel as anxious as you do when you're about to do XYZ thing. In terms of improving self-esteem, finding out about how others feel and having honest conversations. And of course, there's going to be people that are going to tell you that everything's absolutely fine and there's no problems. Of course there are, but like most people, your good friends, your colleagues, like they're going to feel the same as you. And having that conversation, it really takes the sting out of you feeling like you're a fraud, for 100%.
I have one point.
Cool.
I was listening to a couple podcasts yesterday and the day before, so it was a couple. So was it Michael Jordan's coach, Tim Grover? Okay, so he said a really important point. I think it's on Andy Frisella's podcast, the recent one. It's called Winning, the title of the episode. He said, what did it say? When you stop competing, you become destructive. For me, that was very crucial, because when I stopped competing with myself, when I stopped pushing myself, I kind of like slide off, I suppose, who I am in a sense, because I let it slide one task, I let that slide, then I let the next thing slide, then I let the next thing slide, and then before I knew it, I'm where I'm not supposed to be at the end of the day, because I build myself up so much, and then when I stop maintaining the habits, I go lower and lower and lower and lower. And what I think for me was important is to maintain, I suppose, discipline in whatever I do, because when I stop being disciplined, I fall off, and then I arrive at the slump. And then I'm like, how did I get here? This doesn't make sense. And then I realized it's me not holding the promises I said to myself and not sticking to the promises. I think that was, yeah, it was highlight from a point made earlier. When I stopped competing with myself, when you stop competing with yourself, become destructive. Very, very crucial point for myself.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and it kind of links to that thing I read earlier about whether your self-esteem comes from a sense of authenticity or a sense of superiority. And Daanish, I think you and I have quite like different approaches to self-esteem and different things that make us feel good about ourselves. But I think they both come from this sense of authenticity. Like we're both trying to be authentic to ourselves, and that's what's making us feel like we've got sort of a sense of self-worth.
When I look at my ideal self, I look at how much potential he has, and I try and chase that. I try and become closer to that, because I know I can become better, and becoming better, I can I help people around me. That's why I'm like chasing this, not chasing, I'm coming closer to that person. I think, yeah, being authentic to the best version of myself. Like, I don't want to break promises I keep to myself, because I know I'll fall off that and be further away than where I'm supposed to be if I stuck to the promises. Boom.
I think I just keep my head down. I keep my head down. I don't think about competing much, really? Actually, in that sense. No, it doesn't work for me in that sort of sense. It makes me feel. I think that makes me feel more anxious. The idea of competing with myself or with others, and it's interesting. I think that's another one for me, that to improve or to guarantee lower my own self-esteem is put myself into direct competition with somebody else or myself. Like, that's a pretty surefire way of doing it. So I guess my final tip on improving self-esteem is removing yourself from situations that cause you to ruminate, or removing yourself from situations or from those conversations with people that actually make you feel worse about things. So I know that there's a couple of people around in the ether that when I talk to them about what they're doing, it just makes me so hyper anxious, because they're really competitive with things, and that's great, and that obviously works well for their sense of worth and for their sense of self-esteem, but it destroys mine. And so I actually remove myself from the competitive element. So that's awesome for them. That's great, and I think that sort of mentality really kind of keeps people going. For me, it's about not seeing it something that's competitive, and seeing, and that's not to say that you remove any sense of drive or motivation, but actually seeing it as something where I kind of learn to be more reflective or more appreciative of myself, rather than the competitive element, because for me, the competitive element I'll always not be where I want to be, whereas I think what I need to do is figure out how I am closer than I think to where I want to be. But it's just so interesting, because there's so many different ways of approaching this, of getting to exactly the same issue, but in completely different ways. And for everyone, that it's such a continuum.
I'm learning as you're speaking. Like, as I understand your perspective, I'm like, oh, you can look at it from this lens as well, because then through that you kind of like gain a better understanding of like different ways to, I suppose, enhance your own, I suppose, perspective, your own lens of the world,
100%.
of yourself, the world around. Rachel,
also,
what are you going to say?
If you have rumination on your bingo sheet for today, you can tick that off. Neil got that one. Good work, Neil. Thanks. I thought Daanish was going to say it earlier, so I was like getting excited.
Neil done it. Neil done it.
But Neil did it. Well done.
It's a great word. It's just.
Yeah. But yeah, I feel the same. I think with me, when it comes to self-esteem and self-worth, and what I would recommend if this, to see if this works for you, is just focusing on a sense of self-worth, which I can't say. Why do I keep trying to say it? No matter what, like even if you can't say your words properly, you've just got this internal sense that you have some value as a human being, and no matter what, you deserve to be here. Yeah, whether you're succeeding and being the best version of yourself, or maybe you're not. That's kind of my approach. But again, this is just this idea that we've all got different views on this. We've all got different things which help us. And what helps me is just to listen seriously. And I joke about it, but genuinely listening to Pork and Beans by Weezer on repeat really loud in my ears. When I would listen to it when I was feeling really awful about myself, or when you've like, going back to rumination, you've done something mortifying and you are like, I don't know how I'm gonna move on from this. I don't know how my life is going to be okay now. I've done this. Like, I'm thinking of a specific thing which I'm never sharing because it's so embarrassing. But it's so embarrassing. I'm like, oh my God, I can never recover. So I would just like listen to that really loud and just drown out any negative thoughts I was having about myself, and just try and like internalize that. So yeah, see if that works for you. Listening to Pork and Beans by Weezer.
Love it, love it, love it. Now then, lovely humans, we have had a rich and delightful conversation about self-esteem. I've learned a lot. Any final thoughts or any other bits and pieces that anyone wants to add before we head out into the world? We've covered a lot of stuff here.
We covered a lot, and I believe in terms of my notes, I feel like we covered everything. That we mentioned, no one's perfect except, what does it say? Except you are not perfect. No one's perfect.
No one's perfect except for me.
Except for the greatest person that you'll ever meet, Rachel Williams.
Exactly.
Apart from that. So if you are listening, that is the main takeaway from this, is that you will never be as good as Rachel Williams is. Okay.
Yeah, actually, sort of building on from that, and that I feel like they need to clarify that it is a joke, and I don't actually believe that. But also, I think just separating self-esteem from arrogance. I think sometimes there's this perception that if you're someone who has, high self-esteem or strong self-esteem, and you have a strong sense of self-worth, then you're arrogant, or you think you're better than people. When again, that doesn't need to be the case. Just thinking, having a sense of self-worth doesn't make you arrogant, because I think that put me off, like I mentioned in the past, that put me off like trying to work on my self-esteem, because I thought that it was arrogant and self-obsessed to just not hate yourself. So,
you should lift each other up instead of putting each other down. Like if you're lift each other up. That's it.
Definitely.
Very good. Right then, folks. Well, if you are listening and watching, please make sure that you do all of the right things of liking and commenting and subscribing. We'll have all the links to the things we spoke about in the description. So go away and do some reading and some lovely stuff this week. And we will look forward to chatting even more, going even further down other rabbit holes next time.
Let's go.
See ya. Bye.